immigration, a movement of people through a legal process or an established process is only one way. It is to capitalist countries. It is to Canada, United States, Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand. There is no immigration to socialist countries or former socialist countries. There was never one at any point in time. It was an exodus from Eastern Europe, from Russia, not going the other way. Same with China's, and then all the third world countries. So the issue is, we are the only one of a handful of countries that has an open door immigration policy, and can this be indefinitely sustained? Should it be indefinitely sustained? Are we obliged to the rest of the world that we are the country that is going to absorb this population explosion, the growth that is taking place? Is this our obligation, or do we have, in ways that is, quote unquote, our national interest to protect our system of government, our values, our territory, however you say it, that is basically our nation state? Now, I don't think anybody is posing that question. The reason they're not posing it, because we take it as self-evident that, Canada should be an open immigrant society. To me, that is the paradox of the discussion, What is happening in France? What is happening in Germany? A million people came in, and there's an upheaval. And so the idea of immigration that was there for the second half of the 20th century into the 21st century is being revisited. The legal immigrants are saying that, we waited, we followed the legal system. It took us maybe 5 years or 10 years before we submitted our application to have it processed, to have us vetted, for us to come. And now we are suddenly saying anybody can crash the door and walk in. So what is happening is, how long are we going to be able to maintain our system of immigration, which is based upon our sovereignty, our right to decide who comes into our country, and the argument that is being made that migrants have rights and you have to accommodate them. That is the explosive issue of our time. We are assuming that this was the state of affair all the time, and it wasn't the state of affair all the time. Between World War I and World War II, there was no open immigration. There was no open immigration after the end of World War II and the mid-1960s. It was the resettlement of the displaced people of Second World War that took place, but there was no open immigration. So open immigration came about in the mid-60s as a way to counter the Soviet Union and the image about the West being a closed-door society. Now we are faced with the question, is this sustainable? On the one side is the argument that you might say that there are some people arguing, including people in very senior positions of government, former Immigration Minister John McCallum, for instance, former Solicitor General Robert Kaplan, Liberal Party, are arguing that Canada should have a population of 100 million people. But it's not only 100 million. What they're saying is what the European Union is saying it. Here it is. I mean, look at the way he phrases the opening remarks. In terms of immigration, a second advantage is that we have a lot of space. And so if we were to take the lower 1/10 of our land, around 49 parallel, the slice of land adjacent to the US border and increases population to the density of Holland, all of a sudden there would be 400 million Canadians. Now that is where the dilution takes place, and that's what I was pointing out, that if we are going to have an open immigrant policy and we continue, whatever is the number that needs to be discussed, it is not for anybody to dictate to say we're going to be 100 million or 400 million. It needs to be discussed whether there is a consensus in the country to pay the cost of having those numbers. But we cannot have whatever the number is simultaneously with multiculturalism, because the numbers are coming from outside. And at the same time we speak about multiculturalism, then wherever the numbers are coming from, then those numbers and that principle of multiculturalism that says that you maintain your cultures of equal value and equal respect, and those numbers then dissolves the dwindling numbers of those who value liberal culture, the culture of liberal democracy, which is the founding culture of Canada. I am an immigrant, but the question is, at what point you are no longer an immigrant, or you keep on insisting all your life and the lives of your children and grandchildren going forward that you are all immigrants. If that is true, then there is no bonding culture. There is no glue that makes a country a civilization. So I, who came here as an immigrant, at a point when I swore my loyalty by placing my hand on a sacred book and said, and took the oath of being a Canadian, at that point in time, I'm no longer an immigrant. And I don't speak as an immigrant. I speak here as a Canadian. So the opportunity that came about as a result of the invitation that I received from the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration of the House of Commons in October 2012 to come and be a witness and provide a testimony on the subject. The subject was not given to me that, you have to speak on this particular issue, on an aspect of immigration. It was simply to come and speak about, in a generic sense, about immigration as a policy. And I pointed out that right from the beginning, while Canada has been a country that have received immigrants from basically around the world, and particularly in the last 50 years or so, the founders of Canada did not write a constitution for Canada that is to undermine Canadian sovereignty. A constitution is not in any way a suicide pact. So, immigration, in whatever numbers we are engaged in, has to be in some sense determined by the national interest of Canada in terms of Canada's economic well-being, in terms of Canada's security well-being, in terms of how Canada will remain a prosperous society while at the same time protective of its fundamental values. Those fundamental values are values we might define in terms of classical liberalism. That is, classical liberalism is about individual rights and freedom. It is not about collective and group rights. And so, we have to be able to be in a position to determine that a policy of immigration does not undermine our well-being in economic terms, our well-being in security terms, and our well-being ultimately in our fundamental way of how Canada came together and the values that Canada defends. And in those terms, the critical point that I tried to get across to the Standing Committee is that we should pause and think of how we can maintain, on the one hand, an open immigration policy with whatever number that we want to settle upon that comes into Canada, and on the other hand, maintain the position of multiculturalism, that all cultures are equal, that the two are, in a sense, contradictory. that either we can have an open immigration policy in which those whom we invite and accept to become eventually Canadians by allowing them to come in or inviting them to come in and embracing them, it is then a contract. That is, the immigrants we invite comes to Canada and we expect them to adapt to and adopt our fundamental values of classical liberalism. That is, this country is founded upon and based upon respect for individual rights and freedom. And it is not about, you know, what multiculturalism says, that all cultures are equal, and therefore the immigrants, whatever culture they bring, and however incompatible it is with the fundamental values of Canada or the foundational values of Canada, we will go along with them, with that culture that is being imported into the host country. The result of such a policy will be that eventually, and here comes the critical point, it is about numbers, eventually the numbers of people of illiberal culture, illiberal classical culture, that is, cultures that don't value individual rights and freedom, will then dissolve, will then destroy the classical liberal culture of individual rights and freedom. The two cannot go together. That was the message that I wanted to present to the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration. Here I might point out that there's often a confusion or at times a deliberate misreading and misinterpretation that when we are talking about cultures, we are talking as if what an individual wears, how an individual eats, what books an individual read, etc., or in what language a family communicates and they're among themselves, with the members of their own family or with friends of similar background. No, I don't mean by culture that. I mean by culture the way of life, the way of collective existence in which the group rights, the group identity prevails over the individual rights and individual identity. So the illiberal cultures, for instance, the pre-modern cultures of the Middle East or of Africa, of India, of China, are primarily cultures in which the individual rights are not considered legitimate. That's what I mean by culture. A multiculturalism that equates an illiberal culture which does not have respect for individual rights as equal to the culture where individual rights and freedom are the fundamental building blocks of a liberal democracy such as ours, a classical liberal philosophy that is the foundational values of Canada. That's where deliberate confusion takes place or misinterpretation takes place. There is, I think, in recent times, an effort to disparage or denigrate those Canadians, and I would imagine those Canadians are in some sense still a majority of Canadians of European origin, those Canadians whose culture and values, as I would define it, is part of the classical liberal culture, who built Canada, who founded Canada. And there is an effort to denigrate them when they question how this open immigration policy and multiculturalism working together is undermining, is in more ways than we can imagine, diluting and dissolving the Canada that we have known it for the past 100 years, based upon what I am emphasizing those classical liberal values of individual rights and freedom. In other words, that what you believe in, how you conduct yourself as an individual in terms of what are your preferences, what are your tastes, what are your values, what are your beliefs. Those are all matters of your personal choices, and those are protected. Those are protected in terms of individual rights and freedom. However, cultures that do not recognize individual rights and freedom, which is a phenomena of cultures from outside of the Western world in the largest sense of the term, cultures that are in that sense illiberal. Let me be more precise, a culture that values caste over individual, as in India, caste system, or a culture that discriminates and distinguishes between the rights of a male as opposed to the rights of a female, that is gender discrimination, that is prevalent in many of the Middle Eastern and African cultures, predominantly within the Islamic world. And so there is gender discrimination. The rights of a man precedes the rights of a woman, for instance, according to the Sharia. These are illiberal values when measured against the classical liberal values. And so when people are concerned about how these cultures over time, in terms of numbers of people, are going to change the fundamental characteristics of Canada, and they express their concern, and they are smeared as bigots or xenophobes or deplorables or Islamophobes, then what is happening is we are falling under this irony, this trap of political correctness as a way to suffocate, to stifle and censor what should be a legitimate discussion in the public sphere. And we are being denied that. And the denial of such fundamental discussion that needs and ought to take place means then those who are concerned about it, among them a segment of the population, will go in a direction that itself will become illiberal, that they might then take actions, or they might protest, or they might demonstrate, or even turn violent. And that is a result of suppressing free speech. We are in a point in time at a crossroad that we have to make some very difficult and yet urgent choices. And one of the choices is that we have to unelect the existing liberal government. We have to get rid of Justin Trudeau, and we have to get rid of this whole notion of multiculturalism based upon the premise that all cultures are equal, because all cultures are not equal. The founding culture of Canada is not equal to the cultures of the Taliban or to the culture of the people coming from the Middle East or from Africa. We are a unique culture. We are a culture of classical liberal values, and we have to defend that.